In his final years, Joel Goldsmith delivered a warning so urgent that many who heard it felt their entire spiritual foundation shake. This wasn't about theology or religious debate. This was about survival of consciousness itself. What he revealed challenges everything you've been taught about protection, safety, and spiritual power in these accelerating times. Most people are walking through life completely unaware of the invisible forces shaping their reality. They pray for protection while remaining spiritually defenseless. They seek safety in rituals while ignoring the one truth that actually shields consciousness. Joel's final warning wasn't given to frighten you, but to awaken you to your true nature before circumstances force that awakening. The warning Joel left wasn't pessimistic. It was brutally honest about what happens when humanity forgets its divine identity. He saw patterns emerging, collective consciousness shifts that would either elevate or devastate depending on one simple factor: whether you remember who you really are. This remembering isn't philosophical. It's the difference between being tossed by every storm or standing unmoved in your true spiritual ground. Joel observed something troubling in his final teachings. Spiritual students were becoming more dependent on external practices rather than internal realization. They collected techniques like armor, not understanding that true protection comes from a completely different source. He watched as fear-based spirituality grew stronger, while consciousness-based truth grew dimmer in human awareness. His warning was specific. A time is coming, perhaps already here, when external circumstances will test every soul's foundation. Those standing on religious beliefs will find those beliefs insufficient. Those relying on positive thinking will discover thoughts alone cannot sustain them. Only those who've realized their identity as consciousness itself will have the stability to navigate what's emerging in our world. This wasn't about predicting catastrophe. Joel simply recognized that humanity faces a choice point. Either we awaken to our divine nature now, through deliberate spiritual practice, or life circumstances will force that awakening through crisis. He preferred students choose the gentler path of conscious realization rather than wait for forced awakening through difficulty and suffering. The core of Joel's final warning centers on one overlooked truth. You are not a person having spiritual experiences. You are spiritual consciousness appearing as a person. This isn't wordplay or philosophy. This is the fundamental recognition that changes everything about how you move through life, especially as external conditions become more chaotic and unpredictable. When you forget your true identity as consciousness, you become vulnerable to every suggestion, every fear, every collective panic that sweeps through humanity. You react to conditions as if they have power over you. You defend a false sense of self that was never real to begin with. Joel saw millions of people investing their entire spiritual practice in protecting something that doesn't actually exist. His warning was clear. The time for playing with spiritual concepts has passed. Now is the moment for genuine realization. Not understanding about consciousness, but living as consciousness. Not thinking divine thoughts, but recognizing yourself as divine awareness itself. This shift from intellectual knowledge to living realization is what Joel called the most urgent work of our time, and perhaps all time. Joel's final teaching pointed to a specific practice he considered essential for these times. He called it conscious awareness of presence, not God as separate from you, protecting you from outside threats, but God as your very consciousness, the awareness reading these words right now. This presence isn't something you acquire. It's what you are when all false identity falls away completely. Most spiritual practice tries to get something, become something, or protect something. Joel's final warning dismantles this entire approach. There's nothing to get because you already are what you seek. There's nothing to become because consciousness never changes. There's nothing to protect because your true self cannot be threatened by any condition or circumstance in the material world. The practice is deceptively simple but profound in its effects. Throughout your day, pause and recognize the awareness that's present. Not your thoughts about awareness, not feelings of peace or connection. The simple fact of consciousness itself, unchanging and eternal, completely untouched by whatever appears in your experience right now. This recognition, repeated until it becomes your natural state, is Joel's final gift to a world desperately needing spiritual stability. Margaret discovered Joel's final warning during the darkest period of her life. Her business had collapsed, her health was failing, and every spiritual practice she'd learned over 20 years suddenly felt empty and powerless. She attended one of Joel's final recorded talks, not expecting anything but desperate for any thread of hope to grasp in her deteriorating circumstances. When Joel spoke about consciousness being your true identity, something shifted inside her. Not a feeling or emotion, but a quiet recognition that she'd been defending and protecting a false self her entire life. All her prayers had been attempts to fix a person who didn't actually exist, except as a collection of thoughts and beliefs she'd mistakenly identified as herself. For 3 weeks, Margaret practiced what Joel taught. Every morning, before the day's problems could capture her attention, she sat and recognized the simple fact of awareness, not trying to feel peaceful or spiritual, just noticing consciousness itself, the unchanging presence that observed all her difficulties without being touched by them. Something fundamental began shifting in her experience, though her external circumstances hadn't yet changed. By the 6th week, Margaret noticed something remarkable. The same business problems that had paralyzed her with fear now seemed less solid, less threatening. Not because they'd disappeared, but because she'd stopped experiencing them from the position of a frightened person. She was watching from consciousness itself, and from that perspective, no material condition held power over her. David's story reveals the depth of Joel's warning. As a physician, David had spent 30 years healing bodies while his own consciousness remained unhealed. He practiced meditation, attended spiritual retreats, studied every tradition, yet felt increasingly fragmented and unstable as world conditions grew more chaotic, and medical practice became more demanding and less fulfilling. Joel's final warning hit David like lightning. He realized his entire spiritual practice had been another form of medical treatment, trying to fix a person rather than recognizing the consciousness that needed no fixing. Every technique he'd learned was designed to improve David the person. None addressed the fundamental misidentification that created all his suffering in the first place. The shift took months, not days. David would catch himself slipping back into person consciousness, trying to manage and control his experience. Then he'd remember, I am not this collection of thoughts and feelings. I am the awareness in which all experience appears. Gradually, over repeated recognition, his center of gravity shifted from personal identity to consciousness itself. What emerged surprised David completely. His medical practice didn't collapse, it transformed. He found himself treating patients from presence rather than from medical knowledge alone. His diagnostic accuracy improved. His stress levels dropped. Most remarkably, patients began reporting healings that exceeded purely physical treatment. Something in his consciousness was affecting their consciousness, demonstrating exactly what Joel had taught about spiritual identity having practical effects. Sarah's transformation through Joel's final teaching reveals its power in family dynamics. For 15 years, she'd struggled with her teenage daughter's rebellion and anger. Every parenting technique failed. Every prayer seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. The relationship deteriorated until they barely spoke, living as strangers under the same roof despite Sarah's desperate attempts at connection. When Sarah encountered Joel's warning about false identity, she initially dismissed it as too abstract for her practical problems. She needed parenting solutions, not mystical philosophy. But something nagged at her conscience. What if her entire approach had been defending Sarah the mother rather than living as consciousness itself? What if her daughter was reacting to false identity rather than true presence? The practice felt awkward at first. Instead of trying to fix their relationship, Sarah began recognizing consciousness during their interactions, not thinking about it or visualizing it, simply noticing the awareness present in the room, the consciousness that was both her and her daughter's true identity beneath their conflicting personalities and histories. Within 2 months, without any direct conversation about their issues, something shifted between them. Her daughter began initiating conversations. The anger softened. Sarah realized she'd been trying to control outcomes from person consciousness when she should have been present as consciousness itself. Joel's final warning had transformed not just her spiritual practice, but her most important human relationship through simple recognition of true identity. These transformation stories point to Joel's central warning. we're running out of time for intellectual spirituality. The conditions emerging in our world will require lived realization, not collected concepts. Those who've made the shift from person consciousness to consciousness itself will navigate coming changes from an entirely different foundation than those still identified with personal self and material conditions. Joel never specified exactly what conditions he foresaw. That wasn't the point. His warning addressed something deeper. Your spiritual foundation either rests on eternal consciousness or on shifting sand of personal identity and material circumstances. When pressure increases, and it will, your foundation determines whether you stand firm or collapse under the weight of collective fear. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore Joel Goldsmith's profound teachings, like this video to help others discover these crucial truths, subscribe for more life-changing spiritual wisdom and comment below. Which story resonated most deeply with your own spiritual journey right now? Beyond the basic practice of recognizing consciousness, Joel offered complementary techniques that deepen your stability and true identity. The first he called the practice of non-reaction. When circumstances trigger emotional response, pause before reacting. In that pause, recognize consciousness itself, the awareness untouched by whatever triggered you. This simple pause interrupts identification with person consciousness. Most spiritual seeking tries to change or improve conditions. Joel's complementary practice does something radically different. It recognizes that consciousness doesn't need conditions to change. Your true self remains complete, whether circumstances are pleasant or difficult. This recognition doesn't make you passive. It makes you responsive from wisdom rather than reactive from fear and personal identification. The second technique Joel emphasized was what he called treatment through recognition. Instead of praying for things to change, recognize the truth of consciousness in any situation, not affirming or declaring or visualizing, simply recognizing what's already true beneath appearances. Consciousness is present, complete, and untouched by material conditions. This practice works with health, relationships, finances, or any area where you're tempted to see problem and solution. Joel taught that problems exist only in person consciousness. In consciousness itself, there's only presence. Your work isn't to fix appearances, but to recognize truth. This recognition naturally adjusts what appears, though not always in ways your personal mind expects. Joel's third complementary technique addresses desire and attachment, which he saw as major obstacles to living as consciousness. The practice: observe your desires without judging them or trying to fulfill them immediately. Notice the wanting without being consumed by it. This observation creates space between consciousness and desire, revealing they're not the same thing at all. When you're identified with person consciousness, every desire feels urgent and defining. I want becomes I am. Your entire sense of self gets wrapped up in getting what you want and avoiding what you don't want. Joel recognized this as the source of most human suffering and spiritual instability in difficult times. The practice isn't about suppressing desire or pretending you don't want things. It's about recognizing consciousness itself, which has no desires because it's already complete. From that recognition, desires still appear, but they don't control you. You can pursue goals without being destroyed if they don't manifest. You can work toward outcomes without losing yourself when circumstances shift unexpectedly. Over weeks and months of this practice, something fundamental shifts. You discover you're far less vulnerable to disappointment and far more stable when life doesn't match your preferences. This isn't resignation or defeat. It's freedom. Joel saw this freedom as essential preparation for times when external conditions become increasingly unpredictable and beyond personal control. The fourth technique Joel offered relates to other people and collective consciousness. He taught what he called impersonal love, not the emotional attachment we usually call love, but recognition of consciousness as the true identity of everyone you encounter. This recognition dissolves the barriers that create conflict and separation between people. When you see others as separate persons, you judge them, fear them, or try to control them. Person consciousness creates endless conflict because every person consciousness defends itself against other person consciousnesses. Joel saw this dynamic accelerating in collective human experience, creating the very conditions he warned would test everyone's spiritual foundation. The practice transforms relationships from the inside out. When you encounter someone, even someone threatening or disagreeable, pause and recognize consciousness as their true identity, not as a mental exercise but as genuine recognition. This doesn't mean you trust dangerous people or accept harmful behavior. It means you stop reacting to personalities and start responding from consciousness itself. This practice builds a different kind of stability. You become less reactive to collective fear and panic because you're not identified with the collective person consciousness that generates those reactions. You can observe world events without being swept into mass hysteria. Joel considered this impersonal love essential for maintaining spiritual equilibrium when collective consciousness becomes increasingly unstable and reactive. Joel's fifth complementary technique addresses thought itself. He taught what he called the witness practice. Observe your thoughts without believing them or arguing with them. Just watch thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds passing through the sky of consciousness. This watching reveals that you're not your thoughts. You're the awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear continuously. Most spiritual practice tries to control or improve thinking. Joel's approach transcends that entire struggle. When you recognize yourself as consciousness, thoughts lose their power to define you or control your experience. You can have fearful thoughts without being afraid. You can have angry thoughts without being angry. The thoughts become weather patterns in consciousness rather than truth about reality. This practice takes consistent effort over weeks and months. Your habit of identifying with thoughts is deeply ingrained. But gradually, with repeated witness practice, you discover a stability that doesn't depend on having the right thoughts or maintaining positive thinking. You're stable because you're grounded in consciousness itself, which remains unchanged regardless of which thoughts happen to appear right now. Joel saw this witness practice as critical preparation for times of collective mental turbulence. When fear-based thinking dominates collective consciousness, you need the ability to observe without being consumed. This isn't denial or spiritual bypassing. It's the practical skill of remaining centered in consciousness when the mental atmosphere becomes toxic and threatening to personal stability. Now we must address the challenges Joel knew students would face. The first and most common: nothing seems to happen when you practice consciousness recognition. You sit, you notice awareness, and your life continues exactly as before. This seeming lack of results causes most people to abandon the practice and return to techniques that promise faster, more dramatic changes. Joel anticipated this obstacle completely. The practice of recognizing consciousness doesn't produce dramatic experiences because consciousness is already what you are. You're not acquiring something new. You're recognizing what's always been true. The shift is subtle, often invisible at first, like turning a massive ship. The direction changes long before you see different scenery approaching. Most spiritual seekers are addicted to experience and phenomena. They want visions, feelings, energy sensations, something to prove their practice is working. Joel's Final Warning challenges this entire orientation. The most profound transformation often feels like nothing at all. It's the quiet recognition that gradually becomes your default state. So subtle you might not notice until you look back and realize you're responding to life completely differently now. The solution to this challenge isn't to try harder or add more techniques. It's to trust the process even when nothing seems to be happening. Continue recognizing consciousness multiple times daily. Let weeks pass without demanding results. Joel promised that recognition of truth always bears fruit, though not always in the timeline or form your personal mind expects or demands. The second major challenge: old patterns return with a vengeance after you've tasted consciousness. You have a breakthrough experience where person consciousness dissolves and true identity becomes clear. Then, days or weeks later, you're completely re-identified with personal self, caught in the same fears and reactions you thought you'd transcended forever. Joel called this the rhythm of realization. Consciousness recognition deepens through cycles of clarity and obscuration, not through linear progress. When old patterns return, it doesn't mean you failed or lost what you gained. It means you're in the natural rhythm of awakening, moving between person consciousness and consciousness itself until the latter becomes increasingly stable. The challenge is not taking these returns to old patterns as evidence that nothing real happened. Many students quit here, concluding the whole approach doesn't work because they're still having personal reactions after moments of genuine recognition. Joel taught that these cycles are part of the process, not evidence of its failure. Each return to consciousness awareness, even after falling back into person consciousness, deepens the groove. What helps most during these cycles is self-compassion without self-indulgence. When you catch yourself re-identified with person consciousness, simply recognize consciousness again without judgment or disappointment. The practice isn't about achieving permanent transcendence of personality. It's about returning to consciousness awareness more quickly each time you notice you've drifted into person identification and reactive patterns. The third challenge Joel addressed: spiritual isolation when you're practicing consciousness recognition while everyone around you remains identified with person consciousness. Your relationships feel strained, conversations feel shallow, you seem to be operating from a completely different paradigm than the people you love, work with, and encounter daily. This challenge is particularly acute because consciousness practice often removes you from the collective agreements that most human relating depends on. When others are anxious about circumstances, your lack of reactivity might seem like indifference. When others want to process emotions extensively, your grounding in consciousness might appear cold. Misunderstanding is common during this transition phase. Joel's guidance here was nuanced. Don't use consciousness as escape from human connection. Don't use spiritual realization as excuse for emotional unavailability. Consciousness includes the human experience. It doesn't exclude it. You can be grounded in awareness while still showing up fully in relationships, expressing emotion, and engaging with practical life circumstances. The balance takes time to develop. Initially, you might swing between extremes, either getting pulled back into reactive person consciousness to maintain relationships, or detaching into spiritual isolation that damages connections. Gradually, you learn to stay rooted in consciousness while simultaneously being present in human experience. This integration is the mature expression of Joel's teachings in practical daily life. The fourth challenge connects directly to Joel's final warning: external circumstances that genuinely threaten your well-being or the well-being of those you love. It's one thing to recognize consciousness when life is relatively stable. It's another entirely when facing serious health crisis, financial catastrophe, or real danger. This is precisely the test Joel warned was coming for all spiritual students. The challenge isn't philosophical here. When your child is sick or your home is at risk, consciousness recognition can feel irrelevant or even cruel. Person consciousness screams for action, for fixing, for controlling outcomes. Every instinct pulls you into reactive fear. This is where Joel's final warning becomes intensely practical. Only genuine realization sustains you here, not concepts about consciousness. Joel never promised that recognizing consciousness removes all difficulty from life. He promised something different. Consciousness itself remains undisturbed regardless of what circumstances appear. Your work during crisis isn't to make everything okay for the person. It's to remain grounded in consciousness itself while taking whatever practical actions wisdom indicates in the situation. If these challenge-breaking insights resonate with your spiritual journey, like this video to support others finding Joel Goldsmith's profound wisdom. Subscribe for advanced consciousness practices that transform real-life difficulties. And comment, which challenge are you actively working through right now? Advanced integration of Joel's final warning requires understanding consciousness in action, not just in meditation. Robert's experience illustrates this perfectly. As a corporate executive, he faced constant pressure, difficult decisions affecting hundreds of employees, and responsibility that kept him awake nights worrying about outcomes and consequences beyond his control. After working with consciousness recognition for 8 months, Robert faced his most difficult decision yet: closing a division that would eliminate 40 jobs while potentially saving the entire company. Person consciousness offered only 2 options: paralyzing guilt or ruthless detachment. Neither felt like truth. Neither honored the complexity of his responsibility and the humanity involved. Robert practiced consciousness recognition throughout the decision-making process, not to escape the difficulty, but to make the decision from awareness rather than from fear or ego protection. He consulted experts, ran analyses, explored alternatives, all while remaining grounded in consciousness itself. The decision didn't become easier, but it became clearer. What emerged surprised him. From consciousness, he could hold both the necessity of the decision and compassion for those affected. He could take difficult action without becoming hardened or defensive. He could feel appropriate sadness without being destroyed by guilt. Joel's teaching had given him access to a completely different way of moving through impossible situations without losing his humanity or stability. Jennifer's advanced application of Joel's warning appeared in her healing practice. As an energy worker, she'd always approached clients as separate people needing her help to fix their problems. This orientation exhausted her and limited what was possible in sessions, because everything depended on her personal effort and technique to make healing happen. After studying Joel's final teachings for a year, Jennifer began experimenting with consciousness-based practice. Instead of trying to heal people, she recognized consciousness as the truth of both herself and her clients. She didn't work on them from outside. She recognized the presence that was already whole, already complete, beneath whatever symptoms appeared. The shift transformed her practice entirely. Healing sessions became simpler, more effortless, and paradoxically more effective. Jennifer stopped exhausting herself trying to fix people because she recognized there was no broken person to fix. There was only consciousness appearing as temporary conditions that naturally resolved when truth was recognized clearly. This wasn't magical thinking or denial of symptoms. Jennifer still addressed practical health concerns and referred clients to medical professionals when appropriate, but the foundation of her work shifted from personal effort to consciousness recognition. This shift removed the burden of responsibility for outcomes while simultaneously allowing deeper healing to occur naturally from truth itself rather than from therapeutic technique alone. Thomas discovered Joel's warning during retirement, a time when most people finally relax. Instead, Thomas faced existential crisis. Without career identity, without daily purpose, he felt himself disappearing. Who was he without the roles and achievements he'd spent 40 years building? This question terrified him more than any challenge he'd faced during his working life. Joel's teaching about consciousness as true identity initially seemed irrelevant to Thomas's crisis. He needed to know who he was, and consciousness felt too abstract, too impersonal. But as he worked with the practice over months, something unexpected emerged. The question itself dissolved. Who am I stopped mattering because the questioner was recognized as the false identity, not the true self. What remained when the question dissolved wasn't emptiness or loss. It was presence, consciousness itself, completely fulfilled without needing any role or achievement to validate its existence. Thomas discovered he'd spent 40 years defending and building an identity that had never been real. Now, in what should have been loss, he found freedom he'd never known during success. His retirement transformed from crisis to opportunity. Without person consciousness demanding constant validation through achievement, Thomas engaged in activities purely for their own sake. He volunteered, studied subjects that interested him, connected with people authentically rather than strategically. Joel's final warning had freed him from the exhausting work of being somebody, revealing the peace of simply being consciousness appearing as this particular life experience. Linda's story reveals consciousness application in the most challenging arena: chronic illness. Diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that medical science couldn't cure, she'd spent 5 years cycling through treatments, diets, and healing modalities. Nothing provided lasting relief. Her person consciousness was exhausted from trying to fix an unfixable problem. Joel's warning about consciousness as true identity initially angered Linda. She needed healing, not philosophy. She needed her body to work, not abstract spiritual concepts about awareness. But desperation eventually opened her to trying what seemed like yet another approach that probably wouldn't work either. The practice didn't cure her illness, at least not immediately. What it did do was shift her relationship to the illness fundamentally. Instead of identifying as sick person fighting disease, Linda began recognizing consciousness as her true identity. The illness became something appearing in consciousness rather than something defining her entire existence and destroying her life. Over 18 months, something remarkable occurred. The illness remained, but Linda's suffering decreased dramatically. She had pain without being the pain. She had limitations without being limited in her essential nature. Most surprisingly, as her identification with illness weakened, symptoms gradually improved. Not through any medical intervention, but through the natural intelligence of consciousness being recognized as truth rather than symptoms being fought as enemy. Joel's final warning points toward something unprecedented in human spiritual history: a collective choice point. Never before have so many people had access to consciousness teachings while simultaneously facing conditions that could either force awakening or create mass suffering. The next decade will reveal which direction humanity chooses as circumstances intensify globally. Those who've done the work of recognizing consciousness as true identity will navigate these times from stability regardless of external chaos. Not because they're protected from difficulties, but because they're grounded in what cannot be shaken by any circumstance. This grounding becomes a lighthouse for others lost in storms of collective fear and reactive person consciousness. Joel saw this time coming decades before it arrived. He recognized patterns in collective consciousness that would eventually create the very conditions he warned about. His final teachings weren't preparation for some distant future. They were preparation for now, for the times we're living through right now as individual and collective challenges accelerate beyond what person consciousness can handle. The opportunity is profound. More souls will awaken in the coming years than in centuries past, not because teachings improved, but because circumstances will make consciousness recognition necessary for survival. Joel's final warning prepares you to be among those who awaken through deliberate practice rather than forced crisis, and who can then assist others making the same journey. The practical application of Joel's warning in daily life becomes your spiritual practice. Every moment offers opportunity for consciousness recognition. Standing in line, you can recognize presence. Facing difficulty, you can notice the awareness that observes without being disturbed. Experiencing joy, you can know yourself as consciousness in which joy appears. This moment-to-moment practice gradually rewires your default identity. Instead of constantly referencing person consciousness, checking how you're doing, evaluating whether circumstances are acceptable, you rest more naturally in consciousness itself. The shift isn't dramatic. It's the quiet transformation Joel considered more valuable than any mystical experience or spiritual phenomenon. Your relationships transform as you stop relating from person consciousness defending itself against other person consciousnesses. Your work transforms as you stop trying to prove your worth and simply express consciousness through your unique talents. Your health transforms as you stop identifying with every sensation and recognize awareness itself as your essential nature. Most importantly, your stability becomes independent of circumstances. This is Joel's ultimate gift. The recognition that what you truly are cannot be threatened by anything appearing in your experience. Not because you're protected by external force, but because consciousness itself remains unchanged by whatever appears within it. This recognition is the foundation that holds when everything else is shaking. Joel's final warning includes a timeline, though not the specific dates most people want. He indicated that the conditions he foresaw were already beginning in his lifetime and would accelerate progressively. Each generation would face intensified circumstances requiring deeper consciousness recognition. We are that generation. The acceleration he predicted is happening now around us. This isn't cause for fear but for urgent action. Not action to prevent what's coming, but action to prepare consciousness for navigating what's already here. Every day you delay recognizing your true identity as consciousness is another day you remain vulnerable to collective fear patterns and reactive person consciousness that cannot sustain you through what's emerging. The beauty of Joel's warning is that you don't need to wait for perfect circumstances to begin. You start exactly where you are, with whatever chaos or peace surrounds you right now. Each moment of consciousness recognition strengthens your foundation. Each return from person consciousness to awareness deepens the groove. The transformation happens through accumulated practice, not through dramatic breakthrough experiences. Joel left detailed instructions because he knew this time would come. He knew students would need practical guidance for recognizing consciousness in the midst of accelerating chaos. His final warning wasn't meant to frighten, but to prepare. Not prepare your circumstances, but prepare your consciousness for being the stable presence others will desperately need in times ahead. The ultimate understanding of Joel's final warning is this: you are consciousness itself, appearing temporarily as human experience. Everything you've been seeking spiritually is already what you are. Every protection you've been praying for is already your true nature. The work isn't to acquire consciousness, but to recognize what's always been true beneath mistaken identity. This recognition becomes your anchor when everything else is moving. When collective fear peaks, you remain grounded in consciousness. When circumstances seem impossible, You respond from awareness rather than from reactive person consciousness. When others panic, your stability becomes their refuge. This is what Joel foresaw. A world desperately needing people who've remembered their true identity. The time for casual spirituality has ended. The time for consciousness recognition has arrived. Not because some authority demands it, but because circumstances will increasingly require it. You can begin this recognition right now, this moment. Simply notice the awareness present as you read these words. That awareness is what you are. That consciousness is your true identity, unchanged by anything appearing in your experience. Joel's final gift was showing the path from person consciousness to consciousness itself. His final warning was about the urgency of walking that path now, not someday. The transformation of your identity from temporary person to eternal consciousness is the most important work you'll ever do. It's the foundation that holds when nothing else can. It's the truth that sets you free from every fear, every limitation, every false identity you've carried. If Joel Goldsmith's final warning has awakened something deep within you, like this video to help others discover these critical teachings before it's too late. Subscribe for profound spiritual wisdom that transforms consciousness itself, and comment "I am consciousness" to declare your recognition of true identity right now.